tell you about a Jewish guy that was having a problem, and so he went to his rabbi and he said, Rabbi, he said, you will never guess what happened. My son left the house and he became a Christian. And the rabbi looked at him astonished and he said, you'll never guess what happened to me. My son left the house and became a Christian. And the guy goes, what are we going to do? And he says, well, we have to go to God. We have to pray. And so they went to the Lord, and God said, you'll never guess what happened to me. Now we are going to explore a few things this evening, and I've entitled this one "Mary, Did You Know?" Anybody want to sing the song for us? Mary, did you know?
I love that song.
No. Yeah.
Not the pentatonic
Yeah, they could do it.
We don't want that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Marge has a version. Yeah. So I've entitled it "Mary, Did You Know?" And the thrust of it is the question, Mary, did you know? And the answer is no, she didn't. She didn't have a clue at that point. So what I want to do here, we're going to look a little bit at the book of Luke, a little bit at the book of John, but I have a little bit of a review here of some of the things that we've talked about the last couple of weeks here. So remember some of the things that have been presented to us as Christmas and on Christmas cards and things that we've actually kind of found out are probably wrong. Like, for instance, the shepherds were ignorant men that didn't know the promise of the Messiah and could not find employment anywhere else, and that's why they were shepherds. But we found out that they were Levitical shepherds who were tasked at actually tending the sacrificial lambs. And so we saw the symbology there. We understood why it was that Jesus was swaddled and salted. And those that don't know some of these things, just go out to the website and go back and watch the sermons, and we go into depth in there. What did we find out about the innkeeper?
There was no innkeeper.
There was no innkeeper. Bible never mentions an innkeeper. It just says that that there was no room in the dwelling place for them to stay. We also found out that Jesus was not born in a stable, but he was born in a cave. We also found out how many magi?
We don't know.
No one knows. It probably wasn't 3. It could have been 3. No one actually knows. And the only reason that we draw that is because of the 3 gifts. So, the magi were not named, even though later on they kind of gave them some names and thought what their names were. And at one point they actually lost sight of the star. Remember that? So, in their several month journey. We also know that the Magi were not present at the manger, that they actually came probably 2 years later, as the Christmas cards show, which is wrong. And no one actually knows what the star was. So a couple of things that that we've kind of been talking about over the last few weeks there. I've got some other misconceptions that I want to start off with a little bit, and then also go into a few traditions of things that we have heard that may or may not be true. And so we want to talk just a little bit of that. There are people and critics that criticize Christmas because they say it came from a pagan holiday. They say that it comes from the early Romans, who had a feast to honor the god Saturn, and it was right around December 25th that they celebrated that. They say that the Christmas tree is pagan, and I remember growing up that I had some friends that said if you said anything about Santa Claus, that if you kind of rearranged some of the letters in there, that it came out to be Satan's claws. And so I've been around the block a little bit, and I've heard all kinds of things, and guess what? It has not deterred me from liking Christmas, as you that were at our house last week know, with all the lights and the trees and all of the festivities that are there, okay? And so some Christians have that belief, and that's okay. I'm not criticizing them necessarily and saying that they were wrong or whatever. But anyway, so the evergreen was dragged inside during the winter as a symbol of life to the Norse people because of winter solstice, which is it today or tomorrow is winter solstice? Okay, so today. So today is the shortest day of the year, and then tomorrow we start to go back the other way, right? In the northern hemisphere, yes. And so the Norse used that evergreen tree as a symbol of life, and that's kind of where it started with that, okay? About 1,000 miles away from that area of the Norse was the Romans, and they were celebrating Saturnalia, which that was that worship of Saturn. And basically it was just kind of a pagan ritual that was kind of an orgy, really, that went on for like 12 days and that type of thing. And so that was right around the time of December 25th. And that's why it is that we have gotten the misconception that Christmas has come from that. We're going to talk about December 25th in a little bit here, but I want you to kind of keep that in mind. In the 4th century AD, the church officially declared December 25th the feast day of the Nativity. But that didn't come around till the 4th century. Okay? The early Christians, under persecution, if you can think about this, because they were constantly being thrown to the lions and killed in the arenas of Rome, why would they take a pagan holiday of Rome, like Saturnalia, and decide that they were going to marry that with the birth of Christ? Doesn't make sense. And so we are going to be talking about that in just a little bit. Then it's said later on that Constantine picked December 25th for the celebration of Christmas, but that wasn't until like the 1600s. So that was a long time after that too, okay? And so we're going to talk more about December 25th in just a little bit. Okay, now, a couple of elements of Christmas that I want to go over just real quick here. The Yule log. The Norse celebrate Yule, bringing the biggest log that they could find and burning it. And usually if it was a good Yule log, it burned for about 12 days. And so that's kind of where that Yule log came. Now, this Yule log right here I remember as a kid because it was a Yule log cake. Does anybody remember that? And you had that Yule log, and I always looked forward to it every year. My mom made it every year. And I never understood what the deal was with it, but that's really where it came from, is that during this winter time, during the dark times of the Norsemen, they would bring this Yule log in and set it on fire and burn it for this celebration. Now, the evergreens also, by the Norse, were brought inside, and later on they began decorating them with apples because of the Garden of Eden. And so they started hanging apples on the evergreen trees, and that's really what developed later on into our Christmas ornaments. Okay? They also had holly, and the believers celebrated holly as kind of the wreath that went around Jesus, the crown of thorns. And that's kind of where that holly came from. Now, later on in the Middle Ages, about the 5th to the late 15th century, the Gothic cathedrals like Notre Dame, built in 1163, and Salisbury Cathedral in England, built in 1220, began to celebrate something that they called Christ Mass. Okay? And that's where our term Christmas comes from. So Christ Mass. Jeannie and I were discussing this today. And the Mass, it was kind of the symbol of the incarnation, right? Was that the... Tell me.
Christmas is the worship of the Christ, and specifically through the Eucharist.
Yes.
It is to worship him by partaking of
His body and blood. Yes.
on his day. So that's what Eucharist means and Christmas means. So yeah.
Okay.
When you say, that's why I say Merry Christmas is so cool, because you're actually declaring a worship to the Lord.
Yes.
But Christmas got its name by being Christ's Mass.
Yes, Christ's Mass.
Which was understood to
to be the Eucharist that was the symbol of the body and blood of Jesus. And that's kind of where it came from, and that's why it was that we started calling it that. Now, as things progressed in the streets, for instance, we got a lot of our traditions from Germany, from England, and from the Norsemen, okay? So with England, what happened is that in the streets, the celebration kind of gave way to that celebration of that Saturnalia. And so it was kind of more of a riotous type of an area in the early 1800s. And it was almost like more like Mardi Gras, or it was more like Halloween, or it was more like New Year's Eve, because the whole celebration of Christmas at that point was kind of just a drunken orgy, basically, for the most part. Okay, and so so it was like a carnival atmosphere that was there, and most of the houses of England were filled mostly with brawling, drunken villagers, for the most part. Okay. The social classes were flipped at that point, and that was the time when the people who were rich had to invite the people who were poor into their house and give them gifts and all. And if they refused to do that, or if they didn't do that, then the people that were poor would actually perform tricks on them. So almost like trick or treat. And this was the early, stages of that. So because of that, what they did at a certain point is they outlawed Christmas. Okay? Like the Burgermeister Meisterburger, if you remember, the Bankin and or Baskin and Bankin and Bass deal. And so in England, this was 1645. Oliver Cromwell led the Puritans, and they overthrew the king's forces, and they vowed to rid Christmas of this decadent, or they vowed to rid England of this decadent holiday called Christmas. So this is the Puritans. And so high on the list was the English Christmas, and in 1652, they outlawed it altogether. But what happened is that the people never stopped. They just kind of went underground. So all of the things that were associated with Christmas, like mincemeat pie, Christmas pie, at that point, they just simply called it minced pie. And so they didn't call it Christmas pie because it was outlawed at that point. Okay? So 1656, the men of Kent and Canterbury passed a resolution that if they couldn't have Christmas, then they would put the king back on the throne. And this was Charles II. And so when Charles II came back, he restored Christmas, because the English could live without a king, but they could not live without Christmas. Okay? So the Puritan separatists lost their hold on Christmas at that point and the battle with England. So what did they do? Around that time, the Pilgrims come to the New World, to America, around 1620. And in 1659, Christmas was outlawed in the New World, America. So isn't that interesting? So we don't understand kind of where some of this stuff comes from, but it turned out, it started out as kind of a drunken orgy type of thing, then they outlawed it, and then they reinstated it, and then they outlawed it again, and so now they're over in the New World. Even though they outlawed it over here, Captain John Smith, who was he famous for? Who was he with? Pocahontas, right? Captain John Smith, Pocahontas, and Jamestown. Their very first Christmas was kept and quoted with plenty of good oysters, wild fowl, and good bread. And they were also the first to drink eggnog, which was basically nog made from rum at that point. Now, 1776, they abandoned all of the English traditions, right? Because we're starting a new country at this point, 1776. They're abandoning all the traditions, and guess what? 1776, they abandoned Christmas again. And they actually had Congress meet on Christmas Day, just like it was another day, and that continued for another 67 years in our country without Christmas. Okay? So, then America decides to reinvent Christmas. 1820, New York City becomes a center of American commerce. But Christmas once again became riotous, and in 1828, they developed the New York City police force to simply keep Christmas under control because it was so horrific, and people were getting killed, and they were getting mugged, and they were getting beat up. And so what they did was they developed the New York City cops, which I'm sad to say, Blue Bloods has just ended. Yes, one of the greatest shows on TV. With that, I was very sad about that, but that's okay because I've got most of the episodes anyway. And so anyway, so that was what was developed. Now, 1819, and I'm almost done with this, but I'm kind of setting the stage for something here. 1819, does anybody remember who Washington Irving was? What was a very famous thing that Washington Irving wrote? I know you know the name. Think about that for a minute while I take a drink. It was a poem. That's not the one I'm thinking of. He was very famous for The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Remember that? The headless horseman with the pumpkin and all that stuff. He was very famous for that. Yeah. So he writes a book that was called Bracebridge Hall. And it's an enormously popular series of stories where the classes mingle and begin to celebrate Christmas. Okay? Then, 1843 comes along. Go to my next one. You all know this. 1843, over in England, Charles Dickens writes A Christmas Carol, which struck a positive chord on both sides of the Atlantic. The story of conversion and redemption and the salvation of Ebenezer Scrooge. And so after a 200-year drought of Puritan disapproval, Christmas was back. And in 1830, they turned the family back to the nurturing of children rather than children just simply being slaves and to work in the workhouses for the most part. Okay? So now their attention could start to be lavished on their children again, and even seeming to spoil them one day of the year of giving them gifts and giving them presents. And so the pagan traditions were inappropriate for the Victorian home. However, some of the elements became very ripe for revival of this Christmas area there. 1840, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert put up the first Christmas tree. This came from Prince Albert, who was German. O Tannenbaum comes from Germany. They put it up on there. And so this was a drawing, an inking, basically, that they sent out. And in America, or in England, and then, of course, it translated over to America, everyone saw this, and this was the first time that the Christmas tree began to actually come into being there. 1843, J.C. Horsley prints the first Christmas card, which was this one here, both over in England and in America, and it starts to sweep both of the continents by that point. By mid-century, Christmas celebrations were everywhere except in some of the Protestant churches, still a throwback to the Puritans. So at that point, in Victorian America, the Protestants, like the Baptists and the Presbyterians, longed for a celebration also on December 25th, like the Catholics and the Episcopalians. And so they kind of began to put that together. So the Christmas tree was borrowed from Germany, and the Christmas card was borrowed from England, and we began to put it together. At this point, St. Nicholas comes in. And St. Nicholas comes in very prevalent. Of course, St. Nicholas was, a couple of centuries before, and he was actually a saint that gave gifts to people, and he was a very benevolent saint. But when it starts to hit America was Clement Moore, who actually was a minister, who wrote A Visit from St. Nicholas. It was the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. Okay? And he wrote that, and he wrote that for his children. He was an Episcopal minister. Moore is the one also who dreamed up the names of the reindeer. Because previously to this, Dasher and Prancer and Vixen and all of them, they didn't exist. Okay? And this comes about because of this. And so all of a sudden, the American children are scanning the horizon to see St. Nicholas and his flying sleigh at this point. Okay? So it starts to progress. When we go on, nobody really knew what Santa looked like except from that poem by Clement Moore. You know, he was a ripe, jolly old elf, right? So a man by the name of Thomas Nast, who was a cartoonist with Harper's Weekly in 1863, puts together this version of Santa Claus. And so here's kind of where it was. He was a captain of industry with a heart of gold. And the retailers began to use this image to sell gifts without it seeming like they were buying gifts, but it was more of a benevolent type of a thing. Okay? Okay. Now, one more thing. Honorable mention here. Rudolph. Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer. The vestige of Santa had to have a sidekick. And so, in 1939, a copywriter for Montgomery Ward's dashed off a promotional Christmas book to lure shoppers into the store, and he called it Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and the story of Rudolph was born. And the disability that Rudolph had turned out to be an asset for the Christmas story there. And so it was the frail child who basically saved Christmas. Okay? At this point, everything started to be about the kids with Christmas. And the 1950s come in. We've got family engaged with eggnog in the fireplace and Bing Crosby on the hi-fi and loads of presents under the tree. And the rest, as they say, is history. And that is kind of where we've come from. And that is where we have developed all of those things. And guess what? It didn't come from Satan. Some of it was just a progression of history. Okay? Okay, so can we go back for just a moment and let's talk about December 25th? Because everybody says Jesus was born in the summer, right? In order to understand December 25th, we have to understand the book of Luke, and we also have to understand Zechariah. Now, Zechariah was a priest. Who was he married to? Elizabeth. Okay. Zechariah worked in the temple. And so in Luke chapter 1, we have to keep in mind John the Baptist. How is he related to Jesus? Okay, he's his cousin. John the Baptist is 6 months older than Jesus. Okay? According to the Bible, John the Baptist was 6 months older than Jesus. So I want you to remember that. So Luke relates the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist to his elderly parents, Zechariah and Elizabeth. Zechariah was a priest of the class of Abijah, according to Luke 1:5. The 8th class of 24 priestly classes, according to Nehemiah 12:17. Okay? So he was a descendant of these priests. Each class served 1 week in the temple twice a year. Now, Joseph Heinrich Friedlieb, who was a German Roman Catholic theologian, established that the priestly class of Abijah, with Zechariah, would have been on duty during the 2nd week of the Jewish month Tishri, the week of the Day of the Atonement, the deliverance out of Egypt, basically. Or in our calendar year, between September 22nd and September 30th. So while he was on duty at this particular time, the archangel Gabriel comes and informs Zechariah that he and Elizabeth would have a son. Now remember, Zechariah didn't believe it, and so what happened? He couldn't talk. He got struck dumb until John the Baptist was born, right? So while on duty, Gabriel comes, he informs him that. This is Luke 1:5-24, okay? Then they conceived John, who after presumably 40 weeks in the womb, would have been born at the end of June. Okay? Because of September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June. 9 months. Okay? 40 weeks. 9 months. You okay so far? Okay. So, for that reason, they celebrate the nativity of John the Baptist on June 24th. So, September is the annunciation of Elizabeth being pregnant with John because of what Gabriel said, and he was born June 24th, right around there, okay? Luke also records how the angel Gabriel came to Mary and tells her that Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant with John. This is Luke 1:36, which means that the annunciation, the announcement, occurred March 25th, as we celebrate. 9 months after March 25th, or 6 months from June 24th, when John was going to be born, renders the birth of Christ actually December 25th. And they have figured that out. Now, for a long time, we were always told differently. I was always told differently. And that was always the criticism. No, you shouldn't celebrate it December 25th. That was just a date that was picked, and it was from an evil festival that went on and all of that type of thing. But they are discovering now that it actually probably was around December 25th. Even though December 25th has become a tradition, and some of those other things kind of maybe guided it into it or whatever, but the actual birth of Christ is supposed at this point to actually be December 25th. Now, I'm putting that out there for you to think about, and if you want to go and do a bunch more research on it, please feel free to do that. But that, because you'll find all kinds of things out online. No, it didn't happen. He was born in July. And all that kind of stuff. But it's kind of interesting that the church fathers kind of believe that it was around December 25th. So you can argue with people if you want. Got a question? Please.
Okay, so this is what I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Israel has different weather than us, so
Right.
it could look like summer, but
Sure.
not because of the temperature.
It was, sure. Yeah, because they're arid. Sure. The desert and all that stuff. So sure. Yeah, there wasn't snow on the ground for sure. Except maybe in the mountains. Mount Ararat or something. Something like that, sure. Yeah, could be. But anyway, yeah, it's kind of interesting when you do the research that it possibly is December 25th. Okay, so now let's go back to Mary. Mary, did you know the meaning of Christmas when all this started to come upon you? And basically it was no. Does anybody remember the very first words that were recorded that Jesus spoke in the Bible? 12 years old. They go for the feast, right? Joseph and Mary leave. They assume that he's probably with some other relatives or whatever. All of a sudden, he's a lost child. They can't find him, right? Where do they find him?
In his father's house.
In his father's house in the temple. And he says, did you not know, this is Luke 2:49, did you not know that I was supposed to be about my father's business? And obviously the answer is no. Mary did not know. Even though she was promised, this child that you're going to have you're going to be overshadowed by the Holy Spirit and become pregnant, she still didn't know. And so she didn't understand what was going to take place, as none of us would have understood what was going to take place. But it's interesting because 1 John 1 says that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our own eyes, which we have gazed upon and touched with our own hands, this is the word of life. And this is the life that was revealed. We have seen it, we have testified to it, we have proclaimed to you the eternal life that was with the Father and was revealed to us. Now this is 1 John 1. Remember in John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. right? John continues on in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John talking about Jesus as the Word. But as he says this, and he says from the beginning, we have heard all of these things. We have touched him with our own hands, and he has become the Word. The context here that John uses in 1 John 1 is actually like a deposition of a testimony. It's like a legal term, legalese that he is using there, like he is testifying in court of the Son of God and what happened at that point. Okay? So when we start looking at the meaning of Christmas, we first of all understand that Christmas means salvation by grace. The entire New Testament is full of it. Remember, we talked about a couple of weeks ago that the Old Testament is saying the Messiah is coming. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say the Messiah is here, right? And then Acts all the way through Revelation saying the Messiah is going to come back again, right? That is what is happening here when we talk about the meaning of Christmas, because the meaning of Christmas is salvation by grace. Paul tried to get that through the Hebrew head on most of the New Testament, that you can't work your way to God, because they had been steeped in thousands of years of working their way toward God. And you and I still, even in 2024, think that we have to work and that we have to be good enough to please God so that eventually we will go to heaven, right? But the true meaning of Christmas that Mary didn't understand was salvation by grace. Because they were constantly asking him about that. Yeah, but you don't keep the law, and you don't do this, and you don't do that. And he's like, yeah, as long as you believe in me, this is where salvation is, right? The second thing is that Christmas means you can have fellowship with God. So the doctrine of the incarnation, Jesus coming to earth, is fellowship with him. God has gone to infinite lengths to come near to us. And he is not just the man upstairs, the big guy that we talk to or whatever, but he went to intimate, extra lengths so that you and I can understand that because Jesus came at Christmas time, that we can have fellowship with God. God became human and came down to us. Hark the herald angels sing. There's a stanza in there that says, veiled in flesh the Godhead see. Hail the incarnate deity. Pleased with us in flesh to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel. Those Christmas carols, even though sometimes we feel like they're a little bit boring because they're not so modern and all of that type of thing, those people who wrote those Christmas carols back then were very steeped in doctrine. Very theological and very theologically sound. And it talks about that incarnation. John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory and the glory of the one and the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. We behold his glory. And no other time during the year is there so much of his glory beheld as at Christmas time. And so we beheld that glory. Okay? So we can come near to Jesus because he came and he wants to have a relationship with us. And if we've got things that are going on in our lives, it's time for you and me to get closer to him than we've been before. And we can use this Christmas season to be able to do that. Because we look at the world and we look at all the different things that are going on all the time. We get so wrapped up in all of that. And it's like sometimes we lose out of that closeness and that fellowship with God. And that's really the true meaning of Christmas, is God came down incarnate and fellowshiped with us. Third thing, Christmas means love really matters. Now, in the secular world, love is a feeling, right? We've got all kinds of movies about it, especially at Christmas, yes. We've got all kinds of Hallmark movies that's out there that all have the same actors and the same storylines and all of those type of things there. But basically what the world says is that you and I are just a mass with no soul. That your thoughts and your feelings are just chemical responses happening in your brain. And love is nothing but a chemical response in your brain to survive. But even with them thinking that, nobody ever lives like love doesn't matter, because of all the relationships and all the breakups and all the heartache and all of the, Taylor Swift songs, all of that type of thing, right? And so nobody, even if they believe that it's just a chemical response, they don't live like love doesn't matter. But Christmas proves that love pre-existed in the world. John 1, John 5, John 17, 1 John 1. At the beginning of time, the Son was with the Father, and the Word of Christ already was. God was in communion with the Son and the Holy Spirit, and He was love. Glorious love by the three persons. John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it goes down to God comes down to earth, and He comes down to redeem you and me, the incarnation. There's a writer, Dorothy Sayers, and she wrote novels about Lord Peter Wimsey. Some of you may know him, some may not. Basically, he was a dilettante who solves mysteries for his own amusement. Wimsey is an archetype for the British gentleman detective, and he is often assisted by his valet, Mervyn Bunter, by his good friend and later brother-in-law, police detective Charles Parker, and in a few books by someone by the name of Harriet Vane. Now, Harriet Vane later on becomes Lord Peter Wimsey's wife. Dorothy Sayers is the picture of Harriet Vane, and everybody says that Dorothy Sayers wrote herself into the stories to marry Lord Peter Wimsey. And that's kind of the way that God did. See, he was there, he existed, love existed, but what God did through Christ, the incarnation, is He wrote Himself into our story. He wrote Himself into mankind's story with the doctrine of Christmas. And the life that we should have lived, and the death that we should have had, and now the life that we live presently is all because of that incarnation, because of Christmas, because of how Jesus came. And the fourth and the last thing is that Christmas means joy. Jesus came incarnate as a baby to give us joy, because John 3 says, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but so that the world through Him can be saved. Whoever believes in Him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe already has been condemned, because he has not believed in the name of God and His only Son." So, Mary didn't know what all of this was going to lead to. She simply said yes to the obedience of God when the angel said, God's going to overshadow you. And she said, yeah, as you have said, then let it be to me. And so when it comes down to it, Christmas is that joy. So let me leave you with this before we go on for worship here. John 15:9. Jesus Himself says, "As the Father has loved me, so I love you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in His love. I have told you these things so that my joy may be in you, and your joy might be full and complete." So Mary, did you know? No, she didn't. But she understood later on, through Jesus' own words, that he came to bring us completeness, he came to bring us salvation, he came to bring us redemption, and most of all, he brought us joy. And right around this time, you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off, trying to get everything done for Christmas, right? But remember that Jesus brought joy at Christmas for you and me. Okay, stand. Father, I thank you for Jesus coming. And I thank you that you divested yourself and came in the form of a baby to love us and to redeem us and to buy us back from what Satan had messed up. That even before the foundations of the world, that Christ died for our sins. And not only did he die and pay the price for our sins, but then he also later on would rise again the third day, victorious over death, hell, and the grave, and bring us the joy of our salvation. And Lord, I thank you for that. Father, I bless you. And even at this Christmas time, when everything is so harried and put together, as it is every year, just seems like we never learn that. We always say we're going to do better next year, and then we don't, because we get back right into the same traps that we've had before. But Father, that you would help us to understand your completeness and your joy and the true meaning of Christmas and why it was that you came in the first place. And Father, I thank you for that. In Jesus' name.